Beijing fell in 3 years. Baghdad fell in a single siege. Moscow burned. Budapest burned. Kiev burned. In 25 years, the Mongols conquered more territory than Rome did in 4 centuries. But there's one country on this map that never turned red. Not because they won. They didn't win. They were invaded 6 times. Their capital burned. Their king fled to an island. And still, they held out for 40 years. Longer than any other nation the Mongols ever fought. How does a small kingdom survive 4 decades against the most terrifying military machine in human history? The answer isn't in the battles themselves. It's in what they did between the battles, and by the end of this video, you'll understand a survival strategy so effective, empires still study it today. The move nobody saw coming is at 450. Here's the real question. This story asks, when you're facing an opponent, you cannot beat, what do you do? Do you fight? Do you run? Do you negotiate? 800 years ago, one kingdom had to answer that question for real. Their opponent was the Mongol Empire at the time, the most powerful war machine on Earth. This is the story of how they avoided a fight they couldn't win and turned survival itself into a weapon. 1231, the Mongols launched their first full-scale invasion. Here's the thing about Mongol cavalry on open ground. They were essentially unbeatable. Every nation that fought them head-on collapsed. So the Goryeo court made a decision that looked insane at the time. They decided not to fight on land at all. In 1232, the entire royal court packed up and relocated, not to another city, but to an island. Ganghwa Island, separated from the mainland by a narrow, fast-moving strait. The Goryeo records this relocation, not as cowardice, but as a calculated act of national survival. And here's why it worked. The Mongols were a land empire. Horse archers, siege weapons, open-field tactics, all useless against water. Even history's greatest cavalry force couldn't cross a few kilometers of tide. But while the royal court sat safely on that island, someone still had to fight this war. The king was safe. The real war was happening on the mainland, and it wasn't fought by professional soldiers. At the Battle of Cheoin Fortress in 1232, a Buddhist monk named Kim Yunhu led local villagers with no formal military training and killed the Mongol supreme commander Sartai with a single arrow. Having lost their commander, the Mongol army had no choice but to retreat. Over the following decades, the Mongols invaded Korea 6 separate times. The Goryeo records devastation on a massive scale. Countless civilians taken captive, farmland reduced to ash, entire regions emptied out. And still, Korea never fully surrendered. Ordinary people fled to mountain fortresses. They fought as guerrillas. They rebuilt and endured, wave after wave, for nearly 40 years. This isn't a story about winning battles. It's a story about refusing to break. Second insight, sometimes the strategy isn't victory. It's simply not collapsing. But 40 years into a war like this, cracks start to form inside a nation. Here's how they kept that from happening. Here's the part of this story that makes no military sense whatsoever. In the middle of total war cities, burning, people dying, the treasury empty, the Goryeo court decided to do something that had nothing to do with fighting. They carved the entire Buddhist canon onto more than 80,000 wooden printing blocks, a project that took over a decade. On paper, that's a catastrophic waste of resources, in the middle of a war for survival. But seen through the lens of the Goryeo, it means something else entirely. If you can't win with weapons, you need something else to hold a crumbling nation together. The Mongols could burn cities. They could destroy palaces. What they couldn't burn was the thing binding this nation's identity together. The thing that matters most in a crisis isn't your resources. It's the symbol that keeps your people unified. By 1259, nearly 40 years in, Goryeo finally made peace with the Mongols. But how they made that peace is the part almost nobody talks about. Goryeo was never fully absorbed. It wasn't reduced to just another Mongol province. Instead, it kept its own royal bloodline and its own system of government, becoming a subordinate ally through marriage ties to the Mongol imperial family. The secret history of the Mongols. typically records conquest as total absorption. Korea is one of the rare exceptions recorded not as a conquest, but as a negotiated subordinate alliance. That wasn't surrender. That was 40 years of resistance converted directly into negotiating leverage. Korea had proven that the cost of total conquest was simply too high. When total victory is impossible, surviving long enough to reach the negotiating table is its own form of winning. So what does any of this actually mean for us right now? Korea never beat the Mongols on the battlefield, but it was never fully defeated either. They chose their ground. They found a way to endure. They built a symbol strong enough to hold a nation together. And in the end, they earned a seat at the negotiating table not as equals, but with their identity intact. There's a line from classical Eastern thought that fits this perfectly. Strength doesn't guarantee victory. Refusing to break in the end becomes the victory itself. Most of us will never face an army, but everyone eventually faces something overwhelming. And the lesson is the same. You don't always have to win the fight in front of you. Sometimes you just need to choose your ground and refuse to break. If you want the full story of Kim Yun-hoo, the monk who became one of Korea's most unlikely military legends, that video's linked right here. This channel is all about the moments where ancient history quietly reveals how people survive impossible pressure. If you don't want to miss the next one, subscribe and turn on notifications. One last question before you go: if you were in their position, 40 years of pressure with total victory off the table, would you have held on that long? Let me know in the comments.